It's Biome Cycle Results Day, and some of these tanks are about to get ugly. Phase 1. In the first 15 weeks, some end up way uglier than others. Does wet Indonesian live rock provide an easy path that we would all like? The sterile approach has better eDNA results than expected. Does Ocean Direct really add the biome of the sea, or is it just a big bag of sandy snake oil? And can biome cycling a tank for success be as simple as adding a couple cups of established sand from another tank? This is BRStv Investigates, and we're about to find the answers. Tank 1, kicking this off with the wet Indonesian live rock and dry sand. This is the one that we all thought would have the easiest and maybe best results. However, that turned out to be far from the case. Week 1, rock is in and we start our 4-week dark period. This tank looks pretty good, and notably one of the few tanks that show signs of microcrustaceans on the back of the tank in the very first week. Week 2 still looks good. Week 2 is also our first aquabiomics eDNA test, and from a diversity standpoint or sheer number of microorganisms contributing to the microbiome, the Indo rock ranks in the 26th percentile, which is the second best of all the tanks we tested at this point. The 26th percentile means in just 2 weeks, the tank is already more diverse than a fourth of the established healthy tanks out there that aquabiomics has tested. Not surprising from wet live rock. The biome balance, or the measurement of the right things, and are they in reasonable balance with each other? This balance number, or right things, more important than the sheer diversity or number of things. The Indo comes in at the 18th percentile and doesn't really resemble the typical makeup of the healthy tanks aquabiomics tests. However, at this point, the 18th percentile is actually the third best just 2 weeks in. New tanks are just not in balance or stable. And in fact, it might just actually be that the eDNA balance score might be a definable measurement of what we referred to as stability previously. Visually, weeks 3 and 4 also look fairly clean. The rock doesn't appear to have an overwhelming amount of organics or anything on it. Week 4 is the end of our dark period, and when we take the second aquabiomics reading. The difference between week 2 and 4 should demonstrate if the microbiome is evolving, and is it migrating throughout the tank. It's an important measurement before the lights start fueling the photosynthetic pests. The biome diversity actually fell all the way from the 26th percentile to the 4th percentile, and 96% of tanks out there are more diverse than this one. Weaker organisms were outcompeted for resources from week 2 to 4. The balance, however, more than doubles from 18 up to 40 percentile, and you can see the improvements in the chart. This is important because it's a strong indication that the right things are starting to win in this tank. The increase also tells us that the microbiome is migrating off the rock to other surfaces of the tank. The aquabiomics eDNA test samples the water as well as swabs a dark, high flow area of the tank for biofilm. If the biofilm is forming in the dark areas of the tank, it's very likely that it's happening throughout the tank. Okay, so week 5 through 10, we turn the lights on in the LPS zone of 75 to 150 par for 6 weeks. This is a turning point because all the uglies are fueled by light. Week 5 looks fairly clean for live rock, microcrustaceans, increasing populations. Week 6, the rock starts to turn green. Again, microcrustaceans growing. In week 7, what appears to be diatom shows up and persists through week 8, at which point there's a considerable amount of algae growing on the rock. Week 9, we clean the sand and blow the rock off with a small pump to see what returns afterward. Answer is in week 10, the rock continues to degrade, but the sand looks clean. That's the end of the LPS stage, and the next eDNA measurement point, diversity is still low in the 3 percentile. But the balance doubles again all the way up to the 82 percentile. However, looking at the balance, my first question is why these two dominant bars are considered balanced. To get a window into that, remember the 5 major microbiome families typical to a reef tank. 2 of them are well represented here. Also, the typical sample is an average blend of hundreds of healthy reef tanks' microbiomes. Each family is not weighted as equally important. Maybe more important than the balance number is looking for the clues as to what types of microbiome families show up in the tanks that visually perform the best or worst. This wet Indonesian live rock tank may actually share more commonalities with a natural coral reef versus a reef aquarium. The Indo live rock tank was one of only 2 of the 12 tanks which had the free-swimming Bacteriaceae, which aquabiomics suggests are commonly found in pristine ocean reefs, but not in newly established tanks like this one. A valuable note for one of the only rocks from the ocean. In addition to that, one of the primary contributors to biofilm, Rhodobacteriaceae, common in reef tanks, but less dominant in ocean open reefs, is nearly absent from this tank. The aquabiomics eDNA testing is our hobby's first easily accessible look into the microbial war going on in new tanks. We now have access to leading indicators in what's going on in our tanks. How aquabiomics looks at this, the ocean, and reef tanks will certainly evolve as the knowledge evolves. Week 11 through 15, we crank the lights up to the SPS zone of 200 to 350, which will more than double the light energy input to the tank, and presumably the photosynthetics will take off, and they do not disappoint. Week 11 looks okay, but in week 12, an opportunistic form of algae takes advantage of the light and starts to spread. Week 13, you can see small bubbles of matted algae. It's not bubble algae, but something else entirely. This is golden, bubbly mat that looks like a cross between algae and bacterial slime. It's likely a form of chrysophyte. Week 14, you can see it really taking over the entire tank. In week 15, the end of 5 weeks of SPS lighting, the sand is fairly clear, but the rock is overwhelmed with chrysophytes. The eDNA diversity score is still only 10 percentile, and the balance drops to 72, but maintains a very similar makeup. Note, one of the 5 families, Vibrionaceae, is not present, and this will be true for all 12 test tanks at every one of the 48 eDNA measurement points that we made. The lesson here is the family is found in nearly all established reef tanks, but not in many newer tanks. The reason is its close association with animal surfaces, fish, and coral mucus, and its very low density in experiment tanks. However, when we tested the BRS-160, the 900 in Steve's tank, all healthy reefs with lots of coral and fish, they all had more typical levels of Vibrionaceae. That's one of the major takeaways so far. Biome introduction is one thing, but it isn't going to thrive if the preferred food source or environment doesn't exist. Look for that relationship in the rest of this experiment. So the big question is, why did the live rock, what we all thought would perform amongst the best, end up so ugly and covered for gunk for most of the experiment? Well, part of that is certainly that while diversity always sounds good, diverse actually includes all of the good, all of the bad, and often the ugly. So the diversity may be more of a healthy destination than it is a starting point. In fact, total biome diversity up front may represent more challenges than it solves. Another piece of this is we all have selective memories, meaning some of us remember the days of cheap, readily available wet live rock fondly. But do we remember the buckets of GFO, chasing nutrients, funky algae, pest organism battles, and huge dependence on the tank cleanup crew? So much so that if a single yellow tang died, the tank often went south. The people who didn't make it through that are not here to talk about it, only the ones that beat it and the lucky. And a future experiment will attempt to solve some of that by taking the live rock approach to biome one step further and apply what's known as cooking or dark curing the rock for multiple months in the complete dark, preferably in a heated system with good flow. Hopefully retain as much of the good biome while starving out as much of the photosynthetically uglies as possible. I think we may have a different result than this one, but 4 months of cooked live rock is hard to find the most expensive and most time-consuming path. Can we find a better way that doesn't require that? That's what this biome experiment is all about. Next up is our second tank and almost the complete opposite approach, the control of dry rock and dry sand and no clear source of microbiome, and often referred to as the sterile approach. We called it the control because basically everyone assumed it would perform the worst in the DNA testing, and likely visually as well, but something surprises us every day, and this is today's. Starting with week 1 and week 2, not surprising, the rock and sand are clean, but our first eDNA test in this week shows up with an 8th percentile diversity score and a 5 percentile biome balance with what we described as the Wild West. The major families underrepresented here, not at all surprising for dry rock, dry sand 2 weeks in, measured against hundreds of healthy established tanks. Week 3 visually looks largely the same and almost indistinguishable from week 4 as well. Not surprisingly, the biome diversity score is the same at week 4 or at the end of our dark period. The balance gets even worse, down to 3%, with 97% of tanks out there more balanced or similar to a typical reef tank than this one. eDNA not telling a good story. But what happens when the lights turn on at the LPS level of 75 to 150 for the next 6 weeks? Will it get covered in algae or slime? Week 5 looks solid. Week 6, a couple of ugly spots pop in and out of the sand and on the rocks. Week 7, we see the diatom bloom nearly all of the experiment tanks see, and then like the rest, miraculously gone the following week. Week 9 and getting hit with light for almost 5 weeks, the tank still looks almost like brand new. But week 10, we finally start to see some signs of the photosynthetic pests with the rock darkening and a few patches of green. Behind the scenes, the tank's microbiome diversity is nearly unchanged at a 9 percentile. However, the balance jumps all the way up to a 66 percentile. After 10 weeks of cycling, the tank is more balanced than half of the healthy tanks that Aquabiomics has tested. And the breakdown reflects that. The 66 percentile is better than expected. Now's the real challenge. What will happen to the uglies on the rock when we crank up the light to the SPS 200 to 350 par range? Well, in week 11, the brown is replaced with green. In week 12, the green is almost gone, leaving the tank near pristine again. Small ebbs and flows, but nothing is winning. Week 13, there are signs of hair algae with subtle growth through week 14, and in week 15, a similar result of a fairly clean tank. I think a lot of reefers would be happy with the results so far, certainly as compared against the Indo live rock at this point. This is the part that none of us expected. At this point, the diversity jumped all the way up to the 24 percentile. Hard to say where the additional members of the microbiome came from. Could be foods, could be the fish's digestive tract, or just some elements of the microbiome finally grew to a measurable population. But the real surprise is the balance is now a 90. Meaning better than 90% of the tanks out there, and you can see it in the graph. It's pretty darn close to the ratio of the major 5 families in the Aquabiomics typical tank sample. Just for reference, the 90 percentile score for dry Marco rock and dry sand is the absolute best balance score we saw from any of the 12 experiment tanks at week 15, and the tank is arguably the cleanest tank from the experiment. Looking at it, you might just say that that's because it's sterile. But the DNA suggests otherwise. In fact, this is the most balanced tank of the 12 approaches, and the visual assessment matches. This tank had the opportunity to build a healthy microbiome without the introduction or presence of many of the photosynthetic pests. The lack of diversity helped produce this result. However, there's one big question that we all had here. What happens when the tank inevitably has to deal with the uglies that come with the addition of coral? It's also very notable that this tank has no signs of microcrustaceans or pods in the tank as well. We're going to find out if this tank can stand up to the intentional introduction of pests in the next phase of this experiment. Phase 2, we created a slurry of green algae, chrysophytes, cyano, diatoms, and dinos, and then dosed it to these 12 experiment tanks. 4 of them were largely able to fend them off. Will this be one of them? Moving on to tank 3, also dry rock, but we used Ocean Direct sand from CaribSea. Ocean Direct is claimed to be real live sand with the biome of the sea in the bag. Sand is packed moist in a breathable bag, never dried or sifted. The downside is you get varied grain sizes because you can't sift wet sand into distinct sizes. So it ends up a bit smaller than the popular special grade. The real question is, does the sand really contribute to the tank's microbiome, or is it just marketing hype? You can make up your own mind, but I've now seen enough to become a believer. Week 1, you can see the sand blows around a bit more and creates dunes typical to a finer grade sand. Week 2, clean like most of the tanks, diversity score of 7 and balance score in the 2 percentile, with none of the major 5 families represented significantly in this tank. Week 3 continues to look clean, and at the end of the dark period, week 4 almost looks brand new. Diversity fell down to the 2 percentile, but the balance score, or right things, jumps all the way up to a 57 percentile. Meaning better than 57% of the tanks they tested, particularly impressive when compared with the control. Both of these tanks used dry rock, but the dry sand had a 3 percentile balance and the Ocean Direct 57. I'm now a believer because the anecdotal results or experiences that I've had with the sand now match the data to support it. What's interesting is the family that you might expect that dominates the tank. The microbiome is dominated by the Rhodobacteriaceae family, which Aquabiomics shared is largely responsible for the biofilms that populate surfaces in the tank. Essentially, it would appear the sand was a huge addition of microbiome covered surface and the donor of that family. That took about 4 weeks to populate the tank and migrate off that surface to other areas of the tank, and it did it in the dark. Week 5, we turn on the LPS tuned lights. Week 6, the diatoms bloom. It's interesting that this happens at almost every tank, but sometimes takes multiple weeks to dissipate. In this case, 1 week. Week 7, gone as quickly as they came. Tank is basically immaculate for the entire journey from week 8 to 10, no funky slimes or algae showing up. Week 10, diversity score of a 3 percentile, largely the same. The fact is almost none of these tanks ended up very diverse. Remember from last week's episode, even the 900s, with a plethora of introductions of Biome, the diversity score was only 16. Diversity more of a result of a long journey. Once we turn the lights on, the balance score also dropped to the 35 percentile. Different elements of the tank's biome, seeded from the Ocean Direct sand, likely getting a boost from the light or related light-driven organisms. Week 11, we cranked the lights up to the SPS range. No other way to say it than this tank never skips a beat. No visible algae, no slimes, no gunk, all the way to week 15. It just looks pristine. In fact, even after 11 weeks of getting pounded with light, week 5, when the lights come on, and week 15, 10 weeks later, look nearly identical. The diversity score a small jump to the 10th percentile, but the balance recovers to the 80th percentile and the 4th best performer in this experiment. The jury's still out on if this approach will fend off our pest slurry in phase 2, but 15 weeks in with a well-lit fish-only system, there's a lot to like about the Ocean Direct sand and a legit contender for being part of a holistic approach to biome cycling a tank. Next up, dry rock, dry sand, but we seed that sand with 2 cups of sand from an established tank, Steve's Reef tank. This is interesting because it's not all that different from the Ocean Direct approach. Both are based on microbiome seeded sand. This is the one that I was personally rooting for because it could be made accessible to most reefers cheap and easy. Sand has a tremendous amount of surface area, so why not? You'll see why now I'm very unlikely to use sand from an illuminated tank as a biome donor again. Week 1 it looks largely the same, but if you look close you can actually see where we mixed in the sand up front because it's a slightly different color. Week 2 looks the same and has an eDNA diversity score of 10 and a balance score of 6. Both are not impressive. What's interesting is how the eDNA makeup is a different ratio but nearly identical as the Ocean Direct. Week 3 you can see our sand patch and largely no difference going into the week 4, but what you cannot see is what's changed. Diversity score drops out of 2, but the balance jumps all the way up from the 6th percentile to the 41. Some of the desirable microbiome from Steve's donor sand is migrating throughout the tank. Again, what's particularly interesting is the eDNA breakdown of the 4-week results of both the Ocean Direct sand and Steve's donor sand is very similar. Steve's tank just has a lower ratio of Rhodobacteriaceae-driven biofilm. Not surprising because all of the Ocean Direct sand is entirely live with that biofilm, and this tank only has 2 cups which had to migrate onto the new dry surfaces, but still very similar. However, that's where the similarities end. Week 5, we turn on the lights to the LPS zone. Week 5, the diatoms come. This is notable because only a few tanks had the diatom bloom the moment the lights came on, and this is one of them. And they all share one thing in common. The donor biome came from an actual aquarium. Regardless, in week 6, it's gone as quick as it came, but look closely here. There's a brown patch where the donor sand was. In week 7, that's where all the green algae shows up and continues into week 8 as troughs of what appears to be hair algae. I got 2 theories as to why. First, the sand in Steve's tank was obviously exposed to light and likely had photosynthetic organisms on it, even if you couldn't see them. So unlike the Ocean Direct approach, the sand was seeded with some type of photosynthetically uglies. There's also the possibility that the sand is housing nutrients from Steve's tank as well. Essentially feels like we planted algae seeds in nutrient-rich dirt. Week 9 is when we cleaned all the tanks, including siphoning the sand and turning it over, which effectively removes some, buries some, and spreads some algae around the tank. Week 10, the algae stops growing the sand for the most part, and something new starts to grow in the rock. You may think that the hair algae just moved, but I believe it's something else. The beginnings of a filamentous form of chrysophyte. At the end of the LPS phase, we see a diversity score of 6, but the balance score jumps up to 80, which is impressive. So the question is, will the balanced microbiome keep the pests and algae at bay? Week 11, the SPS lights come on. I personally expect to see the chrysophytes explode in the tank, but it doesn't happen. There's just a subtle difference between week 11 and 12 with a tiny increase in algae. Week 13, again, slightly more, but it's thin, wispy, and something's preventing it from exploding in the tank. Could be nutrients or even the sudden change of light, but likely something more than that, maybe a predator. The reason I believe that this is a chrysophyte is because it was never green, more of a light golden brown color, never grows more than an inch, and it showed up everywhere nearly all at once. In this case, it's about to disappear the same way. In week 14, everything starts to turn brown. You might think of it as algae darkening, but it's not. It's the beginning of the worst pest we'll encounter with any of these tanks, an orange slime. Everyone who's seen it has referred to it as explosive diatom, something that appears to be true when we looked at it in a microscope, and confirmed by aquabiomics as well. Without that, slimes can be hard to identify with 100% certainty, and it could have been a lot of different things, but this one is hard to beat. In week 15, it gets worse, takes over the entire tank, turns orange, and stays for months. One interesting note here is I expected the sand to be a source of pods and microcrustaceans from Steve's tanks, but we didn't see that materialize until week 15. Just hints of them. It could be the sand isn't the best way to introduce pods or other microcrustaceans. The sand got turned over and most of them didn't make it. Or it could be a new food source like these diatoms showed up that spurred the pod's growth near week 15. Week 15, the diversity score jumps up into the 30 percentile, but the diverse set of organisms that grew a population capable of being measured are not necessarily good here. The balance score, still a strong 77 percentile. This is a good point to note that the aquabiomics balance score correlates with a lot of good things going on visually in the 12 experiment tanks, but some things do have the ability to win the microbial war regardless. These orange diatoms seem to be one of them. Part of this experiment and progress for the hobby is learning how all this fits together. So I mentioned that I would never use donor sand like this again. These are the reasons why. Sand just seems like a way of introducing the nasties into a new tank, particularly the photosynthetically nasty. In this case, a pest or diatom that completely takes over the tank for months. Possibly even the nutrients from the sand to feed them as well. If I were to use donor sand like this again in the future, I would cook it in the dark for months first. But with today's knowledge, I think I might just use the Ocean Direct sand instead. I'll also note that we sucked out this orange slime or diatoms and dosed it to all 12 tanks in phase 2 or week 16 as part of the pest slurry. And there were 4 approaches or tank styles that beat it, and they all share some similar attributes. The question that's developed for me is it the microbiomes or microcrustaceans or pods that make the difference with these diatoms? There's a story building here. Next, we biome cycle 4 additional approaches. Insta-tanked with coral day 1, 100% of the rock and sand from an established tank, dark cured rubble from an established tank in the sump, and 100% of the water taken from the BRS 160. Which will win, and will they be better than today's batch? Check it out right here.